Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about just generally the 15-minute city. It's something of a topic recently in the West, although it seems to have quietened down a bit recently. But looking at the concept of the planned city or planned district, planned village, planned town, and have a look at the communist era where they really went sort of big on this in the 1950s through the 1970s. And we'll concentrate on Eastern Europe, but in particular the Soviet Union, and look at how their attitudes and views towards city planning or village planning, call it what you like, how they played out in the real world and what the real effects would be, and then have a look at any situation where, be it in a Western country, I've lived in areas where you can walk to the major transport links, you can walk to all the shops, you don't need to use a car. You can. The major train interchange can take you into the city or anywhere around town and that sort of thing. So you end up really not driving anywhere because everything's so close at hand. That's kind of nice, but then you have to live in a very dense populated area for that. So what you gain on one hand, you lose in things like privacy and so on. But let's come back to just this idea of the 15-minute city, and we need to. It's seen as being a bit of a communist thing uniquely. That this is not really true. If you travel around Europe, Germany, Austria, northern Italy, and all that, but you find these self-contained areas where it's a small sort of self-contained suburb, and it's got a lot of jobs there, employment. It's got the train station or the bus interchange. It's a quick journey to the sort of the major autobahn or major highways, and there's grocery stores there, and all the things pretty much you'd need, you maybe not the upper end of the luxury goods, which you still need to go to the big city for, the Louis Vuitton handbags or something. You still need to do that, but in terms of day to day, everything's there. You might need maybe once a week, once a fortnight, something like that, go to another location, but then there's good public transport to take you there. So you don't really need to go anywhere. Now, I've known people that have moved, say, from outer suburban areas where you need a car to go anywhere. It's like a 10-minute drive to the grocery store, a 10-minute drive here, 10-minute drive there. There's nowhere you can go on foot. So you're driving everywhere all the time. And then they move to the inner city, where everything is close by, and they say how fit they've become because they have to walk everywhere, and they notice the difference and how much they save on motor vehicle costs and things like that. Although they pay higher rents and mortgages on the inner city. So, but just looking at this overall, the idea of the planned area around transport and resources is, and I've noticed that when particularly Chinese come to Australia, and people generally from planned economies or third world economies, they heavily cluster around public transport interchange areas and around large shopping centres, because their preference is to have everything close by, because that's what they're used to. Now, to what extent these things are planned or they happen, the populations gather around resources, or the resources put there first. The populations gather, then the resources arrive. So having a look at the communist planned city, I'm not sure you could call it a resounding success. You really need to look at the background. The Soviet Union had a large agricultural sector. So they wanted to industrialize. And to do that, they had to have areas of concentrated areas of industry that were, say, close to raw materials and close to transport links, that sort of thing. So they would bring people forcibly and through various carrot and stick methods, force people out of the rural areas, say from the farms, into the cities to work in the factories. Now that meant that they had to have some sort of housing or accommodation, and a lot of the accommodation was really dormitory style, where you could have, 2 or 4 people living in the small dormitory, and maybe 20 people would share one toilet and one shower, and these sorts of things. So they would they started planning the cities, or what we would call today 15-minute cities, around this moving people from the country to the city. So they were creating new cities, new towns, new suburbs, from sort of the ground up, if you like. And they weren't having to convert existing cities and buildings. Now, the West, by contrast, had much bigger cities and more people in them, and were far more developed, whereas the communists could begin from, again, sort of virgin territory, if you like, and start building their little villages. Then they had the option of planning it down to a micro level, and this is something that they did. Now, you look at sort of for example, one of the requirements was in designing these small suburbs was to say that young children can walk to school without ever having to cross a road. So the residential areas and the schools, like the preschools and kindergartens or other schools, for older kids, the senior high school, they could travel across roads, but for young children, there was this thought, well, we want them to be safe as they walk along, so they can walk along area where there are no roads, or there's only a laneway, or something like that, because child safety was considered an issue. And he said, well, gee, that's a nice thought. So planners had those sorts of ideas in mind. Also, they had ideas of, in architectural design, they would look at the amount of hours of sunlight, in winter and summer, the direction of the sun, and would try and position the windows to get maximum sun in the winter, and have more shade. So it had to be, no maximum. I think I read one where it had to be a maximum of 3 hours sunlight, direct sunlight in the summer, but 5 hours of sunlight in the winter, given the winter days are shorter, and so on. So these sort of things were also. So there was consideration given to comfort as fitting in with not only the natural environment, the amount of sunlight, for example, but also with the things like the children walking to school without having to cross a road. Now, because the Soviet state was centrally planned, they could allocate, so well, let's put a factory over there, and that'll give employment for the people in this town or this village. Okay, we'll have the bus station. Everything could be planned down to the micro detail, and was. So the idea was that these people would never need to leave the area. And he said, well, that's good. You don't need. No, that wasn't the purpose. The idea was that nobody would travel outside of their area. There were heavy travel restrictions. They didn't want people to travel. Now, if you had a compelling case, like you lived here and your dying mother lived over there, they would let you travel. I mean, you could still travel, but you had to have a good reason to travel, and you had to appear before communist goon tribunals and so on to justify why you needed to go away from your local area to another village or town or to a city or so on. So they would have these quite severe restrictions, and if you were more than 20 miles away from where you lived, there were people, large numbers of police on the streets. And they knew everyone in the area, or pretty much. They'd say, hey, we don't know that guy. Papers, please. Well, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And so there was just too much aggravation. And if you weren't convincing enough in your explanations, they could drag you in for an all-day interrogation. And there are all sorts of political police that used to sit around with not much to do except to interrogate some people who were viewed as a bit, maybe a bit suspicious. Why are you not in your village? So they didn't want people to travel. They didn't want people to move, and not unreasonably, they thought, well, what if we provide everything they need, as in, the schools, the employment, the grocery store, whatever. We supply everything they need within that area, then they don't need to travel, which means if they are traveling, then automatically they're suspicious, and we need to check them out. So as a way of social control that we don't appreciate in the West and don't understand. So none of a lot of the making these cities self-sufficient, self-contained areas wasn't some sort of benign or benevolent gesture. It was part of the overall program of social control, of not having people move around. Now because they're moving large numbers of people from the rural areas where they lived with their families, extended families and that sort of thing, into the city where they were living with people they didn't know and hadn't met. The central controllers and planners thought this was a good idea, putting people together who didn't know and hadn't met each other, given how naturally suspicious the Russians are of anyone they don't know. Then they thought this was a good idea for preventing collaboration for uprisings or political unrest and things like that. They thought this was a good idea. So putting people in, so they would purposefully pick people and put them together in dormitories who were unlikely to get on or have anything in common, which means you had to be, and you had to share kitchens. Sometimes 20, 30 people had to share one kitchen and share a toilet and, this sort of thing. So you had to be reasonably good at, navigating around and working around difficult people. And a lot of the way the Eastern Europeans and Russians did this was through, a form of sort of, paranoid subterfuge, where you just viewed everyone as your enemy. Now, coming back to the 15-minute city, though, it still was a plus, I think, if you look at all the different aspects of quality of life, to say, well, I can get anything I want and walk anywhere. The kids can safely walk to school without getting run over by a truck or something. All these sorts of things. I can walk to the grocery store. As I walk back from the factory, from work, I can pass the grocery store and get I don't know, get whatever you want, get something for dinner that night, and then get back to the apartment. Now they build these apartment blocks with sort of prefabbed, prefabricated sections and put them together. Now the quality of the materials was poor. The quality of the workmanship and the joining and the finishing off and the concreting and cementing, all these things were also, poor. So that leaks were common, walls were thin. You could hear the next door neighbour and so on. Water pipes were constantly breaking. Windows didn't fit the frame properly, so you'd have cold air coming in. It was very difficult to keep the place heated, and the list of complaints was endless. But compared to what people had, it was most likely an improvement. And if you're well connected in the party ideological hack goon department, then you could get quite a nice place to live that was made to a much higher standard, and it had many more facilities, amenities. You had your own private bathroom, things like that. So this was a way of living that had the state's need to exercise and institute social controls to show that they were doing something for the people, creating these 15-minute cities. It had some convenience built in, but again, it was came from a place of controlling the populace. Now, even if you go through Germany, you still see these smaller satellite town villages and so on around the place, and again, northern Italy, Austria, and so on. So this was more a European mindset, wider sort of pan-European mindset that crept into all sorts of urban planning. And you even saw in the 1970s, say in places like Australia, you saw this idea of creating these outer suburban sort of small cities, out of the downtown area and into the into the further suburbs, and then developing those. The planning wasn't anywhere near to the micro stage it was in, for example, the communist Soviet Union, but it still had conceptually had that same idea that we can create these, people would live, work, and so on outside in these outer new suburbs, these newly developed suburbs. It just never worked out that way. The downtown area of the city, Sydney as an example, has sort of half the employment of the entire state is just in one city. So this is, and also the best paid jobs. Now, the idea of the Soviet or the communist system was, keeping people in their regional areas and having these 15-minute cities to aid in doing it. It meant that people couldn't associate or couldn't gather freely, and which is something that was really why these 15-minute cities failed in the West. The right of association meant that people could go where they wanted to go, whereas in the communist or the planned system, only a very small number of people could go where they wanted to go. The rest were, if you were, for example, an outstanding athlete, and could play on the world stage, then you could go where you wanted to go. Or if you were a world-renowned scientist, you could, and so on. Or if you were a communist ideology teacher, you had many liberties other people didn't have. But outside of that, you couldn't move around. You had strict and heavy controls over where you went and for how long and so on. Even if you got a pass to go and visit your sick mother in wherever, typically the pass would be for a week or even for a few days. So again, by restricting the right of association and restricting freedom of association, they could make these 15-minute cities in the communist societies work in a way that you never could in the West, because with freedom of association, people choose to do different things. For example, someone who thinks they can move from the smaller rural town into the city and do better for themselves, they'll do that. So they'll move out of the town. So why invest in a town, a rural town when people, anyone with any ability or capability or ambition or drive is going to leave as soon as they can? Sure, there's some people that are left behind to work in the factory, who've got no sort of ambition. Even in the 1950s, there were American movies or like documentary type things that were being put around in the schools, the high schools. And they were saying, well, look, there are three types of people there. These, you call them today, you'd say they were borderline propaganda, but they were rather practical in many ways. And these American high school movies, I don't know what you call them, short movies, they would say, look, if you've got ambition and drive and you really want to do something, you're going to have to leave the small town. You need to go to the city. You need to consider college. These are the things you need to do. Now, if you don't want to do college, that's fine too. So you can go and get a job, and through hard work, ingenuity, application, drive, commitment, you can still do quite well for yourself, far better than you could if you stayed in the rural township. So then there was the, well, look, you might, if you're part of the elite of the local town, like your father owns the factory, or half the land in the town's owned by your dad, then you may want to stay because you've got a big investment here and you've got some sort of family business that can be passed on through the generations. If you're someone who's got no ambition and you've got no real drive and you're not particularly interested in getting in, do some local apprenticeship, become a mechanic or something like that, or just go and work in the factory as some sort of shit kicker. Do that, and that'll be fine. So they pretty much exhorted brighter and harder working, kids that sort of dreamed big to get them to go to the cities, and this meant that they were not investing in these rural towns. They may have invested in suburbs around the bigger cities in America and the West generally, but they weren't interested in these smaller towns. So really, when you look at, say, the Rust Belt, already in the 1950s, you can see the attitude was the future is going to be in the cities, not in any of these rural or even small city type townships. So the idea of freedom of association, people moving around, means that 15-minute cities will never really work where you still have freedom of association. The key part that made 15-minute cities work in the planned communist societies was where freedom of association was not allowed. We need to understand and comprehend that as we talk about and consider 15-minute cities today. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.